The caricatures that Navarro advances actually explain how China achieved successful industrialization.
At the receiving end of the US economic warfare. Any country that refuses to be a US vassal is subjected to Washington's bullying playbook, particularly big countries. One interesting country is, and on issues vital to sovereignty, India has quietly but firmly resisted American coercion, especially as even the most pro-Western Indian elites now see that Washington only treats India as an exploitable market and a pawn in its anti-China game. As a result, by now a monumental history has already begun.
Donald Trump likes to call himself an outsider, a populist fighting for the people against the establishment.
Our movement is about replacing a failed and corrupt, and when I say corrupt, I'm talking about totally corrupt, political establishment with a new government controlled by you, the American people.
But the truth is different. Behind Trump stands a powerful coalition of billionaires, financiers, and Silicon Valley moguls, the very corporate America that helped rig the US economic system in the first place. Even the real highlight of Trump's presidential inauguration wasn't populism. It was the parade of corporate America's elite gathered around him. A look at the influential figure in the Trump's regime clarifies that the Trump administration actually reflects the power of the Wall Street and Silicon Valley. Let's take, for instance, billionaire Nelson Peltz, who made his fortune in junk bonds and leveraged buyouts. He is the chief architect of electoral fundraising for Trump campaign and is now an influential figure within the Trump ruling elite. Or John Paulson, the hedge fund manager who became rich by betting against the American homeowner, is now a key advisor to Trump in economic affairs. Or Steve Wynn, the Las Vegas casino magnate and long-term Trump associate, is now elevated as finance chair and advisor. David Sachs, a crypto baron, now leads the AI and crypto wing in Trump administration. He has helped crypto become an unprecedented financial asset, now also a financial bubble backed by the dollar. Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal, and Joe Lonsdale together co-founded Palantir, a notorious defense tech giant with CIA contracts, infamous for powering US mass surveillance, ICE deportation, predictive policing, military targeting, and a direct partner with the Israeli Defense Forces, providing AI-driven battlefield intelligence in the genocide going on in Gaza. Now Thiel, Sachs, and Lonsdale are top advisors for the Trump administration on military and international affairs. Or take, say, venture capital giants like Mac Andreessen and Ben Horowitz. They are the other Silicon Valley giants that represent the billionaire raj that Trump now heads. In fact, Vice President J.D. Vance is himself a former Silicon Valley venture capitalist and was funded by Peter Thiel, the PayPal mafia. Or take, say, Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary. He was the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, an investment bank, before he joined the Trump administration. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, perhaps the most important person behind Trump's economic policies as called by the Bloomberg, has been a top hedge fund manager who was a chief investment manager for super billionaires like George Soros and Stanley Druckenmiller. Finally, Steve Witkoff, arguably the most important White House official in charge of foreign relations. Trump himself and his son-in-law Jared Kushner all come from the New York real estate empire, who have made their official trips an extension of their business empire. This isn't a government of outsiders. It is in fact a merger of Trump's White House with the billionaire class, financiers, hedge fund managers, real estate moguls, casino tycoons, investment bankers, and tech capitalists, the very establishment Trump claimed to oppose. In his administration, there isn't a single union leader, labor representative, or advocate for ordinary workers. Not even one. Instead, the cabinet and top advisors are tech finance capitalists. It is the pure merger of state power with corporate America. What else can explain the spectacle of top CEOs like Apple's Tim Cook showing up in White House to present Trump with lavish personal gifts, including a gold bar? Anywhere else, this would be condemned as a corruption or at the very best crony capitalism. Now imagine the outrage within the American press if the president of China were to be handed such gifts by Chinese business leaders. The story doesn't stop with the billionaires writing checks. The same class has funded a powerful network of conservative think tanks and elevated ideologues who now sit inside the Trump administration. They are the architects of a doctrine that combines unrestricted corporate freedom with economic warfare abroad. Take, say, Peter Navarro, the chief trade and manufacture strategist within Trump administration, has been one of the administration's most influential voices on trade. He advocates a policy of permanent tariff wars on China, describing tariffs as a revenue machine for Washington. Lately, he has been extending this rhetoric to other countries like India. His approach uses duties on imported goods effectively paid by American consumers and working class to help finance tax cuts for the wealthy while simultaneously constraining industrial development abroad. Navarro's book, Coming China Wars and Death by China, actually revealed the heart of his trade argument. It is a peculiar mix of free trade faith and American exceptionalism. He assumes that genuine free trade always favors the United States. By this logic, China's economic rise can only be explained by what he portrays as piracy, fraud, forced labor, and manipulation, not by fair competition. As a side note, Navarro has nothing to say about the history of US corporations abandoning manufacturing for finance in pursuit of higher accumulation through unprecedented dividends, interest, and rents. He ignores the reality that America's own strategy of financial hegemony, drawing in on global capital, has repeatedly stifled its industrial growth by driving up the dollar and undermining export competitiveness. Equally absent is any recognition of the extensive scholarship on China's industrial rise, its deliberate investment in human capital, state control of land, sustained public spending on infrastructure, strict financial regulation, and the unique hybrid sector that is based on public-private partnership in China. These policies, rather than the caricatures that Navarro advances, actually explain how China achieved successful industrialization. Anyway, returning back to our theme of policy influencers, Navarro is not alone. He is joined by Stephen Miran, associated with the conservative Manhattan Institute and Hudson Bay Capital. Miran is now the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Trump administration. He has crafted the so-called Mar-a-Lago Accord plan. The Mar-a-Lago Accord intends to use tariffs and US military leverage to force other countries into a political dollar devaluation to boost US export at others' expense. This is inspired by the infamous 1985 Plaza Accord that politically forced Japan to financialize its industrial economy, which ultimately led to financial crash, crippling Japan's economy forever. Miran's Mar-a-Lago Accord plan represents a beggar-thy-neighbor approach, blackmailing others into sacrificing their own industries in the interest of the United States. Next is American Compass, financed by billionaire hedge fund manager Thomas Klingenstein and the Walton family. American Compass is a forefront think tank pushing for high tariffs as a way to create a hard break with China, calling for severing all investments, supply chains, and capital flows. Klingenstein has his own think tank too, the Claremont Institute, which has been part of the ecosystem promoting economic warfare on the rest of the world, particularly big countries like China, India, Russia, and Brazil. Corporate America, along with these far-right thinker and think tanks, have planned to force a global order that is driven by a carrot-and-stick approach of free market and tribute, whose chief enforcer is White House. This has confused many astute observers to mistake Trumpnomics to be a reversal of globalization. In reality, Trumpnomics is not a reversal of globalization. It is, in fact, recreation of globalization, where non-economic force of the US administration will complement corporate America's market force to stop the rise of other nations. Well, we have a simple word for that in the global south. It is called imperialism.
billionaire class in the US has pushed for an economic warfare of coercive globalization, forcing weaker countries to open up their markets, give up policy space, and hand over rents and privileges to US corporations in exchange for token tariff relief. For example, the recent Indonesia-US deal forced Indonesia to eliminate 99% of tariffs on US imports, while its own exports still face an average 19% tariffs into the US. Indonesia has agreed to remove content requirements for US goods, accept weaker US vehicle safety and emissions, automatically recognize FDA approvals for medical devices and pharmaceuticals, exempt US food and agriculture from local licensing, accept US certifications for meat, dairy, and poultry, eliminate tariffs on intangible goods, and support a moratorium on digital duties that protect big tech, and adopt restrictive intellectual property rules to weaken protections for traditional knowledge and generic resources, making it harder to use compulsory licenses to lower drug prices or challenge monopolies, ultimately to ensure big pharma and US corporations capture rents from knowledge, medicine, and biotech. All this has meant that Indonesia has to give up its national interest to regulate its own sphere in the interest of corporate America. In his interview with Bloomberg, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent blatantly admits that one of his main objectives with the tariff is using it as a leverage to coerce other countries into concessions, investments, or tribute payments. He said under Trump, I quote, "Tariff gun will always be loaded and on the table." The success of using tariff as an exacting mechanism has been seen recently when Japan, South Korea, and EU accepted double-digit tariffs in exchange of hundreds of billions of dollars of US investment fund. Never mind, the funds pledged are larger than what would be actually realized. What is important is that the US has used the tariffs to force investment flow in its favor in a classic neo-feudal style. It is neo-feudal because under feudalism, the vassals had to pledge bigger tribute than they actually handed over. The functional role of this pledge is to reiterate power, and their cultural symbolism is as important as the actual economic rent. But not every country accepts vassal status like the US allies. Many big powers have refused to be a vassal of the United States, and that is changing the global order from below. The foremost is, of course, China. Since 2017, when the Trump administration started imposing tariffs on China as part of its attempt to contain China, Beijing has constantly imposed retaliatory tariffs on a broad range of US imports. For instance, the US share of China's agriculture imports slid to 12% in 2024 from 20% in 2016. While Brazil's share of China's import rose to 22% from mere 14%. In line with Chinese track record of retaliation, after the sweeping tariffs on April 2, the so-called Liberation Day, China immediately unveiled a plan to trim by 10% soy meal inclusion in its animal feed by 2030, a move that could slash annual soybean imports by about 10 million tons, or nearly half of US soybean exports to China last year. As China pivots to Latin America to substitute US imports to China, Trump administration escalated attack on Latin America.
We talked about Venezuela today also, by the way. Venezuela is a mess. It's a very dangerous mess and a very sad situation. But we talked about Venezuela also. Many options for Venezuela. And by the way, I'm not going to rule out a military option.
Which includes the recent attacks on Brazil. China recognizes that tariffs are pretext to a larger economic warfare to stall its development, and so it quickly borrowed from Washington's own playbook and unleashed a series of retaliatory economic warfare on Washington. China, with its monopoly on rare earth minerals, announced export bans on gallium and germanium used in semiconductors. This threatened US multinational corporations like Nvidia and its allies like the TSMC, which fabricate chips. China also limited graphite exports, key to the EV batteries, in response to US chip restrictions. The most important element of Chinese retaliation is that it has hit where the US doesn't want to be hit, its defense and tech industries. But Beijing's retaliation is not limited to sanctions. It has also escalated the tariff ladder, starting with 15% on coal and LNG and 10% on machinery and vehicles, then scaling up to 34%, 84%, and even 125%, targeting broad US imports, including agriculture and industrial goods. On the investment side, China's retaliation includes reduction of holdings of US treasuries to the lowest in over a decade, increase of gold purchases to record levels, expanded use of the yuan in trade settlements, especially with Russia, West Asia, and Africa, and launch of the cross-border interbank payment systems as an alternative to the Western SWIFT system. This has created a huge panic in Washington over bond yields and hegemony of the dollar, so much so that the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, in an interview with Bloomberg, has said that protecting the hegemony of the US dollar has become one of his chief concerns recently. Meanwhile, China is shaping the world through deepening ties with the rest of the world, including decreasing its reliance on the West by expanding trade beyond the United States. In 2023, ASEAN countries surpassed the US and US-China's largest trading partner. China-Africa trade has topped $280 billion with record investment in infrastructure. Trade with Latin America exceeded $480 billion centered on energy and agriculture. And the Belt and Road Initiative has now signed deals with 150 countries, cementing global ties. But China is not the only country at the receiving end of the US economic warfare. Any country that refuses to be a US vassal is subjected to Washington's bullying playbook, particularly big countries. One interesting country is India. In the early 1970s, Washington opened to Beijing to reshape the Cold War balance. After Henry Kissinger's secret trip to China in July 1971, President Nixon met Chairman Mao in February 1972 and issued the Shanghai Communique, the launch point for US-China normalization. The move explicitly wrote the existing Sino-Soviet split to perpetuate differences between Moscow and Beijing. Fast forward, realist pundits like John Mearsheimer have long argued that the US should normalize with Russia to contain a rising China.
Your policy recommendation towards engaging in China, because quite often there is one aspect of your writings that is just talking about the reality. But then there are also aspects where you advocate policies. We have seen it in Iraq, Israel, Russia, and so on. So do you personally believe that the United States should contain China? And if yes, then what should be those means and forms of containing China?
There's no question in my mind that the United States should contain China. My theory of international politics tells me that as China grows more powerful, the smart thing for China to do, is to dominate Asia, East Asia, the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. And the reason you want to do that, if you're China, is that's the best way to enhance your security. The more powerful you are in your own region, and of course, if you become a regional hegemon, you've reached the pinnacle of power in your region, then you maximize your security. The United States is a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. And if China is smart, it will try to become a regional hegemon in East Asia. However, this is not in America's national interest.
This has, however, failed spectacularly as NATO's proxy war with Russia has only closed gaps between China and Russia. What many commentators actually consider more realistic instead was use a rising India to contain superpower rival China, just as Washington once used a rising China to contain a superpower rival Soviet Union. Yet this use India against China gambit is running against the beggar thy neighbor strategy of Washington under the Trump administration. During the first Trump administration, in June 2018, US imposed 25% tariffs on Indian steel and 10% tariff on Indian aluminum. Next year, by 2019, US terminated India's GSP duty-free benefit status. After Trump came to power again, this escalation against India continued. On April 2, the so-called Liberation Day, 26% tariff was announced on India. Finally, on August 7, 25% tariff was made effective. But if this was not enough, a few days later, 25% additional sanctions were applied to India for buying Russian oil. As it stands now, India faces a total of 50% tariff, exactly equal to that of China. Of course, India is not China. It cannot mount the same scale of retaliation against Washington. But its sheer size means New Delhi cannot be armed twisted like smaller nations either. And on issues vital to sovereignty, India has quietly but firmly resisted American coercion. Take, say, agriculture. Washington demanded India open its dairy, livestock, and crop markets to subsidize US agribusinesses. India refused it, protecting its peasant economy already battered by debt and climate stress. It is important to note that Indian small peasant comprises of one of the poorest population on earth. In other words, Trump's agriculture tariff wars on India are despicable economic warfare fought by Washington on one of the poorest working people on earth. The US also pressed India to cut reliance on Russian arms that represents still more than half of India's arsenal, so that the US defense contractors like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Raytheon could capture the Indian market. The US even imposed sanctions on India for trading with Russia. But India refused to commit suicide by turning to expensive and unreliable US defense contracts, especially as even the most pro-Western Indian elites now see that Washington only treats India as an exploitable market and a pawn in its anti-China game. As a result, by now a monumental geopolitical shift is underway, which affects not just Asia but the entire global politics. And that shift is marked by India's refusal to continue severing its ties with China for the interest of the United States. In just the past few weeks, India restored tourist visas for Chinese nationals, cleared long-blocked Chinese investments in India, hosted Wang Yi's meeting with External Affairs Minister of India Jaishankar and National Security Advisor Ajit Doval. India also signed a new border agreement to reduce troop tensions with China and move towards a negotiated settlement. On the other side, China responded by opening the Mansarovar pilgrimage in Tibet for Indian pilgrims. And during the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, Indian Prime Minister Modi's visit to China have been covered extremely enthusiastically and with dignity in top Chinese media and official circles. What makes this even more striking is the timing. These changes come despite recent clashes between India and China in Galwan Valley, and despite the widespread Indian perception that China supported Pakistan during the recent India-Pakistan 8-day escalation, which Beijing of course has denied. Clearly, Delhi has recognized a deeper urgency. Resisting Washington's coercive order requires cooperation with China, not endless confrontation. This India-China normalization is historic. It allows Russia, which maintains ironclad ties with both India and China, to consolidate BRICS as a geopolitical and economic axis. In fact, for the first time since the decline of the non-aligned movement in the 1980s, the Global South is regaining a coherent anti-imperialist collective politics. Ironically, it is the aggression of Trump and his billionaire class that has created the very conditions for this revival, pushing India and China, once adversaries, towards common ground. Our prediction is clear. Regardless of the speed or depth of the infant India-China normalization, a new chapter of geopolitical history has already begun. The Asian century is taking shape, and big powers in Asia are writing their own autonomous histories with less and less Western influence. A year ago, this was mere speculation, but as the saying goes, there are weeks in which decades happen. That the past few weeks have created waves that will last for decades, and fewer nations will ever trust the billionaire Raj of the West again.
Hey YouTube, if you have watched our show, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. You could also check out our Substack where we bring long format articles on geopolitics, economics and events around the world. Finally, don't forget to check out our podcasts where we combine reliable insights from our guests with regular updates on current events.